Emma, we've decided you're no longer part of this family. My father's words hit me across the table at the restaurant, landing somewhere between the untouched mimosa and the basket of pastries I'd lost my appetite for the moment I saw their faces. It was graduation morning, May 14th, 2024, and instead of celebrating, I was watching my mother Patricia slide a manila folder across the white tablecloth with the same expression she'd used to dismiss a servant. "These are disownment papers," she said, her perfectly manicured nail tapping the folder. "We've had our attorney draw them up. We're making it official." My brother Marcus sat beside them, smirking into his coffee cup, and I felt something inside me that had been cracking for 22 years finally break clean through. "Your computer science degree," my father Richard continued, cutting into his eggs Benedict without looking at me, "has been a complete waste of our money and time. 4 years at Stanford. And for what? So you can sit in front of a computer screen in some cubicle making pennies?" Patricia nodded, dabbing her lips with her napkin. "Marcus has a real degree, a business degree that means something. He has prospects, a future. You've chosen to throw away every opportunity we gave you." I stared at the folder, my hands folded in my lap beneath the table where they couldn't see them shaking. This wasn't new. None of this was new. I'd spent my entire childhood watching Marcus's mediocrity celebrated while my achievements disappeared into silence. When I was 10 and won the regional math competition, they'd missed the ceremony because Marcus had a baseball game where he sat on the bench the entire time. When I was 15 and my robotics team took second place at nationals, they'd forgotten to pick me up from the airport because they were helping Marcus prepare for his driver's test that he failed twice. When I got my acceptance letter from Stanford with a partial scholarship, they'd spent dinner talking about Marcus's acceptance to state school with no scholarship at all, and how proud they were of his solid choice. I remembered sitting at that dinner table 4 years ago, holding my Stanford letter, waiting for someone to acknowledge what I'd accomplished, and watching my father raise his glass to toast Marcus instead. The pattern had been set long before I understood what it meant. Now here we were, graduation morning, and they were making it official with legal documents. I was 22 years old, about to graduate summa cum laude from one of the best computer science programs in the country, and my parents were disowning me. But there was something they didn't know, something I'd built in the quiet spaces of their inattention. Something that would change everything in about 3 hours when I walked across that graduation stage. I picked up the folder with steady hands, opened it, and looked at the papers inside. "I understand," I said quietly, and I did. I finally understood exactly who they were, and more importantly, who I was despite them. "There's also the matter of your trust fund," Richard said, signaling the waiter for more coffee as if we were discussing something as mundane as the weather. "The $250,000 your grandmother left you, we're transferring it to Marcus effective immediately." I felt the air leave my lungs. My grandmother, my father's mother who died when I was 16, had been the only person in the family besides Aunt Linda who ever saw me, really saw me, and she'd left me money for my future in her will. I'd never touched it, never even thought about it much, because I'd been taught not to rely on it, but knowing it existed had felt like a small validation that someone had believed I mattered. "Marcus has real business ventures that need capital," Patricia added, her tone suggesting this was perfectly reasonable. "Your degree isn't going to generate returns. His investments will benefit the whole family." Marcus had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to object. "I've got some solid opportunities, Em," he said, using the nickname he never actually used. "Tech startups, real estate partnerships. Dad and I have been talking, and with the right seed money, I could really build something." I wanted to laugh at the irony, but my throat was too tight. "You're taking my inheritance and giving it to him," I said, needing to hear myself say it out loud to believe it was really happening. "We're reallocating family resources to where they'll be most effective," Richard corrected, as if using business language made the theft more palatable. That's when Aunt Linda's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. Are you people listening to yourselves? She'd been sitting at the end of the table, and I'd almost forgotten she was there until she spoke. Linda was my father's younger sister, the one who'd left the family business to become a non-profit director, the one they tolerated at family events but never really respected. You're disowning your daughter and stealing her inheritance on her graduation day. Do you have any idea how cruel you sound? Patricia's smile went brittle. Linda, this is really not your concern. This is between us and our children. Emma is your child, Linda said, her voice shaking with anger I'd never heard from her before. She's your daughter, and you're treating her like she's worthless. Richard held up his hand in that dismissive way he had perfected over years of running board meetings. Linda, you've always been overly emotional about these things. We're making a practical decision based on realistic assessments of future returns. Emma's made her choices, Marcus has made his, and we're supporting the child who has actual potential for success. The words should have destroyed me, and part of me felt them trying to. But another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger over the past 2 years, remained perfectly still and clear. They didn't know. They had no idea what I'd been building while they ignored me. I thought back to sophomore year, October 2020, sitting in my dorm room at 2 in the morning, finishing my first freelance coding project for a startup that paid me $3,000 for 3 weeks of work. I remembered the shock of seeing that money hit my bank account, money I'd earned myself through skills I'd developed, and realizing I didn't have to wait for anyone's permission or approval to build something real. Stanford's graduation ceremony was held at the Stanford Stadium, and as we walked through the entrance at 11 that morning, I was struck by how something so monumental could feel so hollow when you were experiencing it alone in a crowd of celebration. Thousands of graduates in cardinal red robes filled the field. Families packed the stands decorated with banners and balloons, and everywhere I looked, I saw parents hugging their children, taking photos, crying happy tears, celebrating this milestone with genuine pride and joy. My family walked in a tight cluster with me trailing slightly behind, the Disownment papers folded in my purse alongside my phone and lipstick, a surreal combination of the mundane and the life-altering. We found our section in the family seating area, Marcus immediately pulling out his phone to text someone, probably his girlfriend who'd wisely decided to skip this particular family event. I still can't believe we have to sit through 4 hours of this, Marcus said loudly enough that the family next to us glanced over. All these nerds getting degrees that won't mean anything in 5 years when AI takes their jobs anyway. At least I got a degree in something that matters, something human that can't be automated. Patricia nodded absently, scanning the crowd with that particular expression she wore at social events, calculating who was watching, who mattered, what impression we were making as a family. I just hope none of the Hendersons are here, she murmured. Margaret Henderson was asking me at the club last week what Emma was doing after graduation, and I had to be so vague because what am I supposed to say? That she's going to be unemployed with a computer degree? Richard hadn't looked up from his phone since we sat down, responding to work emails with the same attention he'd given most of my childhood milestones. I sat at the end of our row, leaving an empty seat between Marcus and me, and watched a father 3 rows ahead adjust his daughter's graduation cap tenderly, saw a mother crying while hugging her son, observed family after family radiating the kind of love and pride I'd spent 22 years trying to earn and never receiving. I'd felt invisible my entire life, but never more than in moments like this, when the contrast was so stark. I remembered junior year of high school, coming home with the trophy from the state coding competition, first place out of 300 participants, scholarship, offers from the sponsors, my photo in the local paper, and walking into the house to find my parents had converted my room into a home gym for Marcus without telling me because he needed it for football training, and I was always on my computer anyway, so what did it matter where I slept? They'd moved my things into the basement guest room, packed up my desk and bookshelves and the few personal items that marked the space as mine. And when I stood there in the doorway holding my trophy, my mother had said, "Don't be dramatic, Emma. You're not home that much anyway, with all your computer club activities. And Marcus needs proper equipment if he's going to get a sports scholarship," which he never got because he quit football 2 months later. Aunt Linda reached over Marcus and squeezed my hand. And I squeezed back, grateful for her presence even though she couldn't fix any of this. The ceremony began with the processional, and I watched the faculty in their academic regalia file onto the stage, knowing that in less than 2 hours, everything would change. The ceremony moved through its carefully choreographed stages with the kind of ritualistic precision that major universities had perfected over centuries. The opening speeches from the university president and the student valedictorian washing over me while I sat in my cardinal red robes and thought about everything that had brought me to this moment. Names began to be called alphabetically by school and department, and I watched hundreds of students walk across the stage to receive their diplomas, each one shaking hands with the dean, posing for the official photographer, then returning to their seats while their families cheered and took photos and celebrated this culmination of 4 years of work. I reflected on my own 4 years at Stanford, the incredible loneliness of achieving things that nobody in my family cared about, the late nights in the engineering library writing code until 3 in the morning, the problem sets and projects and exams that I'd poured myself into, partly because I loved the work and partly because excellence was the only thing I knew how to pursue when love was unavailable. I thought about the project that had consumed the last 18 months of my life. The secret I'd kept from my family, not out of any strategic planning, but simply because they'd never asked. Never shown the slightest interest in what I was actually doing with my time beyond their dismissive jokes about my nerd degree. It had started in January of my junior year, winter quarter 2022, when my roommate Jessica and I were complaining about the terrible educational software we'd both been forced to use in various courses, clunky interfaces, and one-size-fits-all approaches that didn't adapt to individual learning styles. And Jessica had said half-jokingly that we could build something better, and I'd realized she was right. We'd started TeachSphere as a side project, an AI-powered educational platform that used machine learning to adapt to each student's learning pace and style, providing personalized lessons and real-time feedback that actually helped people learn instead of just testing what they'd memorized. Jessica handled the educational theory and user experience design, while I built the technical infrastructure, and we'd worked on it obsessively through junior year and into senior year, operating in what the startup world calls stealth mode, building and testing and refining without public announcement. We'd incorporated as an LLC, brought on 2 other Stanford students as junior developers, and by the fall of my senior year, we had a working product that we began quietly beta testing with local schools. The response had been extraordinary, teachers reporting significant improvement in student engagement and outcomes. And by December, we had 5,000 users, and by February, we had 50,000. And then in March, the acquisition offers had started coming in from major tech companies who'd somehow discovered what we were building. I remembered sitting in a conference room at Tech Vision Industries in Palo Alto 6 months ago, March 2024, listening to their CEO James Chen explain why they wanted to acquire TeachSphere and making the decision that would change my life. And now as the ceremony reached the School of Engineering section and my row was called to stand, I felt my heart begin to race because I knew what was coming next, knew that the life I'd been living in 2 separate worlds was about to collapse into one, and there would be no hiding anymore. Emma Catherine Hartwell, Bachelor of Science in Computer Science, with honors, the announcer called, and I walked across the stage on slightly unsteady legs, shook the Dean of Engineering's hand, accepted my diploma in its leather folder, posed for the photographer, and had just begun walking toward the steps to return to my seat when Dean Roberts himself stepped to the microphone and said, Ms. Hartwell, if you could please remain on stage for a moment. And I froze, turning back toward him with genuine confusion because this wasn't part of the plan we'd discussed, or at least not the timing I'd expected. And I could feel thousands of eyes on me, including my family's. And when I glanced toward our section, I saw my mother leaning forward with a puzzled expression, my father's attention finally pulled from his phone, and Marcus looking confused in that particular way he had when something was happening that he didn't understand and didn't like. Dean Roberts waited for me to return to center stage before he spoke again, his voice carrying across the stadium through the sound system, saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct privilege to announce that Emma Hartwell is this year's recipient of the Stanford Founders Award for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, an honor we bestow only once every 5 years to a graduating student who has demonstrated exceptional achievement in creating new technology or ventures that embody Stanford's spirit of innovation and impact." And the applause that followed was substantial, but confused because most people, including my family, had no idea what this meant or why I was receiving it. And I stood there feeling the weight of this moment I'd known was coming, but hadn't quite believed would really happen. The moment where the two separate lives I'd been living would collide in front of everyone who mattered and everyone who'd dismissed me. Dean Roberts continued, "Emma graduated this morning with a perfect 4.0 grade point average across 4 years of rigorous computer science coursework. But her achievements extend far beyond the classroom. She has published 3 peer-reviewed papers in artificial intelligence and machine learning journals, filed 2 patents for novel educational algorithms, and served as a teaching assistant for advanced courses while maintaining her perfect academic record." And I watched my father's face shift from confusion to something that might have been concern, watched my mother grip the armrest of her seat, watched Marcus's perpetual smirk finally fade into uncertainty, while Aunt Linda beside them had started crying and smiling simultaneously in that way people do when they're witnessing something they've hoped for but never expected to see. The dean described my research work, my contributions to the computer science department, the recommendations from faculty that called me one of the most brilliant students they'd taught in decades, and with each sentence I felt something shifting inside me. Not quite vindication yet, but the beginning of it, mixed with the grief of knowing that this moment of recognition I'd worked so hard for was still not the same as simply being loved, that proving your worth to strangers would never quite heal the wound of not mattering to the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, but it was something. And right now, standing on this stage in front of 8,000 people with my family, finally paying attention, it felt like enough. "What many of you may not know," Dean Roberts continued, his voice carrying across the hushed stadium with growing enthusiasm, "is that Emma co-founded a company during her time here at Stanford, working on it alongside her rigorous academic schedule, and that company, TeachSphere, has revolutionized adaptive learning technology in ways that are already transforming education across the globe. And I felt the moment arrive, the secret I'd kept for 18 months, suddenly becoming public knowledge in front of 8,000 people, including the family who'd handed me disownment papers over breakfast." And the dean went on to explain how TeachSphere's AI-powered platform had grown from a dorm room project to a fully functioning educational technology company with over 500,000 active users across 30 countries, how teachers and students were reporting unprecedented improvements in learning outcomes, how the adaptive algorithms I developed were being studied by researchers at other institutions, and I watched my parents' faces transform from concern to visible shock, both of them leaning forward in their seats now, with their full attention locked on the stage. My mother's hand pressed against her chest, and my father's expression showing something I'd never seen before, a kind of stunned disbelief that would have been satisfying if it wasn't also breaking something inside me, because this was the moment I'd both dreaded and anticipated for 6 months. The moment when they would finally understand exactly what they'd dismissed and discarded. Dean Roberts continued, "TeachSphere attracted significant attention from major technology companies interested in educational innovation, and 6 months ago, In March of this year, the company was acquired by TechVision Industries in a transaction that recognized both the technical sophistication of the platform and the vision of its young founders. And as he spoke, the massive screens flanking the stage lit up with the TechVision Industries logo, and a press release dated March 15, 2024, announcing the acquisition, and I could see Marcus leaning toward our parents, whispering something urgent, could see my mother's face going pale even from this distance, could see my father's jaw literally hanging open in a way that might have been comical if this whole situation wasn't so devastating, while Aunt Linda was openly crying now, her hands clasped together as if in prayer, and I realized I was processing this moment in a strange, dissociated way, part of me feeling the vindication I'd imagined, the proof that my worthless degree and wasted money had produced something extraordinary, but another part of me feeling oddly empty because what I'd really wanted my whole life wasn't their shock or their belated recognition, but simply their love, their pride in me for who I was, rather than what I'd achieved. And that was something this moment of public triumph couldn't provide no matter how many people were applauding. "It is my great honor," Dean Roberts said, "to invite a special guest to present this award to Emma, someone who recognized her exceptional talent and vision, the CEO of TechVision Industries, Mr. James Chen." And I knew this was coming, had known since we planned this moment 3 weeks ago. But hearing his name announced still sent a jolt through me because James Chen was a legend in Silicon Valley, a man whose face appeared on magazine covers and whose company was valued at $40 billion. And as he walked onto the stage in his perfectly tailored suit, I heard audible gasps from the audience and saw my family's shock deepen into something approaching panic, because they were finally beginning to understand exactly how badly they'd miscalculated, how completely they'd failed to see who their daughter actually was, and this was the moment everything would change forever. James Chen crossed the stage with the confident ease of someone who'd delivered keynote addresses to thousands, his presence commanding immediate attention even in a stadium full of graduates and families. And when he reached the microphone, he smiled warmly at me before turning to address the audience, saying, "Thank you, Dean Roberts, and congratulations to all of Stanford's graduating class of 2024. His voice rich with genuine enthusiasm that carried across the stadium. And then he continued, "About 18 months ago, TechVision Industries began searching for innovative educational technology that could genuinely transform how students learn, not just digitize existing methods, but fundamentally reimagine the educational experience using artificial intelligence and adaptive learning systems. And we reviewed dozens of companies and platforms from around the world, met with teams from established education technology firms, but nothing we found came close to what two Stanford students had built in their dorm room." And he paused for effect while I stood beside him feeling surreal, watching my family's faces from the stage, seeing my mother gripping my father's arm now, seeing Marcus lean forward as if getting closer would help him understand what was happening. And James turned to me then, with genuine warmth in his expression, saying, "Emma, when our team first saw TeachSphere's demo, we knew immediately we were looking at something special. But it wasn't until I met with you and Jessica personally that I understood the true depth of what you'd created, the vision behind it, and frankly, the brilliant technical execution that my own engineers said shouldn't have been possible for a team of two working part-time." And the audience laughed appreciatively while I felt my face flush, and he continued speaking directly to me in a way that felt more like a conversation than a speech. "You walked me through your algorithms, explained your approach to adaptive learning pathways, showed me data on student outcomes that exceeded anything we'd seen in the industry, and you did all of this while maintaining perfect grades and conducting original research. And I remember thinking that TechVision needed people like you, people who could see possibilities others missed and had the technical skills to make them reality." He turned back to the audience, and his voice took on a more formal tone as he said, "In March of this year, TechVision Industries acquired TeachSphere for $47 million. And the number hung in the air for a moment before the audience erupted in applause and shocked exclamations. And I watched my father's face go completely white, watched my mother's mouth form a perfect O of shock, watched Marcus literally slide back in his seat as if he'd been physically pushed, while Aunt Linda was standing now, clapping with her hands above her head, tears streaming down her face, and James continued over the noise. Emma held a 60% stake in the company, which means at age 22, she concluded a transaction worth $28.2 million. And the stadium erupted again, louder this time. And I stood there feeling the weight of this public revelation, the moment I'd both anticipated and feared for 6 months, knowing that my family was finally understanding exactly what they'd dismissed when they handed me those disownment papers over breakfast. And James was still speaking, saying, "But beyond the acquisition, I'm pleased to announce that Emma has accepted a position at Tech Vision Industries as our Director of Educational Innovation, making her the youngest person to hold a director-level position in our company's history, where she'll be leading our efforts to transform global education with a starting salary of $350,000. And I felt something break open inside me then. Not quite joy, because joy would have meant sharing this with parents who loved me, but something like vindication mixed with grief, the bitter satisfaction of proving my worth to people who should have seen it all along. And as the audience gave a standing ovation and my family sat frozen in their seats, I understood that this moment of public triumph was also the final death of the relationship I'd always wanted with them, the acknowledgement that I would have to build my life without their love. And standing on that stage beside James Chen with 8,000 people applauding, I felt both powerful and achingly alone. James Chen placed the Crystal Award in my hands, the weight of it substantial and real, the facets catching the stadium lights and throwing small rainbows across my graduation gown. And he shook my hand with both of his, in a gesture that felt genuinely warm, before the Stanford president joined us on stage for photographs. And I stood between these two powerful figures, while media photographers, who'd apparently been invited specifically for this moment, captured images that I knew would appear in tech publications and Stanford's promotional materials, immortalizing this moment of triumph that felt simultaneously vindicating and heartbreaking. And during a brief pause between photos, I allowed myself to glance toward where my family sat in section 114, row K, and what I saw confirmed everything I'd suspected about this moment. My father Richard sat with his mouth literally hanging open in an expression of shock so profound it would have been comical in any other context. His carefully maintained composure completely shattered. The man who'd dismissed my achievements, my entire life, finally understanding exactly what he'd overlooked. And beside him, my mother Patricia gripped her designer purse with white knuckles, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the leather as if holding on to something physical could help her process what she'd just learned, her face showing not pride or joy but something closer to panic as the implications crashed over her. And Marcus, my golden child brother, who'd made jokes about my nerd degree just an hour ago over breakfast, looked physically ill, his face pale and his posture slumped as if someone had knocked the air from his lungs, while Aunt Linda, beautiful Aunt Linda who'd always seen me, stood clapping with tears streaming down her face, her expression showing pure joy uncontaminated by calculation or regret. The photographs concluded, and I made my way down from the stage carrying the Crystal Award, feeling its weight as both literal object and metaphor for everything I'd accomplished without my family's support or recognition. And as I walked back to my seat, the graduates around me offered quiet congratulations, some of them classmates who'd known about TeachSphere, and others who were just learning about it now, and I could feel my family's eyes tracking my movement through the crowd, could sense their desperate need to reach me, to say something, to somehow undo the morning's disownment, now that they understood I wasn't the failure they'd assumed, but instead worth $28.2 million, plus a director-level position at one of Silicon Valley's most prestigious companies. I took my seat in row F, section 102, carefully placing the Crystal Award on my lap where it caught the afternoon sun, and Dean Roberts returned to the podium to continue with the remaining ceremony proceedings, calling more names and conferring more degrees. But my family sat in stunned silence, no longer making dismissive comments, or checking phones, or displaying the casual disinterest that had characterized their attendance up until 20 minutes ago. And I could hear whispers from relatives who'd been seated near them, Uncle Tom and Aunt Carol and my cousins who'd witnessed the presentation and were now undoubtedly discussing its significance, the sheer magnitude of what had just been revealed. And I sat there processing the complex tangle of emotions that comes with finally, definitively, proving your worth to people who should have valued you all along, the victory that feels less like triumph and more like the end of hope for something you'd wanted your entire life. The ceremony continued around me, but I was barely present for it, my mind simultaneously experiencing vindication at their shock and grief, at the fact that this moment had been necessary at all, that I'd needed to earn $28 million and receive recognition from a tech industry legend before my parents would even consider that I might have value. And the truth I was confronting in that moment was that I'd proven my worth, but the victory felt hollow, because what I'd actually wanted wasn't their shocked recognition of my achievements, but their unconditional love for the person I was, and that was something no amount of money or success could retroactively provide. The ceremony concluded with the traditional turning of tassels and throwing of caps, graduates around me celebrating with pure joy, while I felt the weight of what was coming next, the inevitable confrontation with my family who would want to talk, to explain, to somehow claim connection to my success, and I knew with absolute certainty that the reckoning was about to begin. The ceremony ended and graduates flooded toward their families in a chaos of celebration and relief, caps still sailing through the air while the band played the school anthem, and I stood carefully holding my crystal award and looking for the fastest exit route because I knew what was coming. But before I could move, Aunt Linda pushed through the crowd and reached me first, her arms wrapping around me in an embrace that felt like absolution, and she whispered, "I am so proud of you, Emma, so incredibly proud," her voice thick with emotion, and I let myself sink into that hug for just a moment, drawing strength from the one person in my family who'd always seen me. But then I heard my mother's voice cutting through the crowd saying, "Emma, Emma sweetie, wait." And I pulled back from Aunt Linda to see my parents fighting their way toward me with Marcus trailing behind. And the transformation in their demeanor was so complete and so transparent, it would have been laughable if it weren't so enraging. Because my mother's face had rearranged itself into an expression of beaming maternal pride that hadn't existed 2 hours ago, when she'd handed me disownment papers over breakfast. And my father wore a smile that looked painful, as if his face had forgotten how to form that expression in relation to me. And when they reached me, my mother immediately gushed, "Oh, Emma, we're just so proud of you. I always knew you were special, always knew you'd do something amazing." And the words hit me like physical blows because of their blatant dishonesty, because this morning she'd called my degree worthless, and now she was claiming she'd always believed in me. And my father jumped in with, "That's right, Emma, we always supported your dreams, always knew you had it in you." And I stood there feeling rage build in my chest like a physical pressure, because they were rewriting history right in front of me, performing parental pride for the relatives and graduates who surrounded us, and Marcus shuffled forward, saying, "Congratulations, sis, that's really amazing, really impressive," using a term of affection he'd never once employed in our actual relationship. And I responded with cold politeness, my voice flat and empty of emotion as I said, "Thank you," giving them nothing more. And my mother reached for my arm with desperate enthusiasm, saying, "We should all go celebrate. We made reservations at Giovanni's, your favorite restaurant. We can have a proper family celebration." Which was a lie, because Giovanni's was Marcus's favorite restaurant, and she'd never once asked me where I liked to eat. And I said simply, "No thank you, I have other plans," and I watched my mother's smile falter, watched desperation creep into her eyes as she said, "Oh, but Emma, this is your graduation. We should celebrate as a family. We want to hear all about your company and your new position." And the transparency of it was stunning. The way they suddenly wanted to hear about achievements they'd never asked about before. and my father attempted to employ the authoritative tone that had worked my entire childhood, saying, "Emma, we need to discuss this. We're your family, and we'll be celebrating together." And I met his eyes with a level gaze that held none of my former compliance, and said, "Actually, I have plans with friends, people who've supported me throughout college," emphasizing the last words just enough to make the point. And Aunt Linda stood beside me like a guard, her presence supportive and proud, and I could see other graduates and families slowing down around us, sensing drama, beginning to witness this confrontation that was about to crack my family open in public view. My mother reached for me again, attempting to pull me into a hug that would look maternal and affectionate to the families milling around us. But I stepped back deliberately, putting physical distance between us that made her arms drop awkwardly to her sides, and I saw hurt flash across her face, hurt that she had no right to feel after this morning, after 22 years of making me feel invisible. And my father's voice took on an edge of command as he said, "Emma, we need to talk about this privately. As a family, this isn't the place for whatever you think you're proving." And I met his eyes with a calm I'd never possessed before today, and said clearly, "I have nothing to discuss with you privately or otherwise." And Marcus stepped forward with an attempt at the easy, brotherly charm he'd never once directed at me, saying, "Come on, Em. Don't be like this. We're all just surprised and really happy for you. Let's go somewhere and talk." Using a nickname he'd never called me in our lives. And I felt my hand move almost of its own accord to my bag, feeling for the envelope that was still there, the disownment papers they'd presented me with just hours ago over Eggs Benedict, and dismissive comments about my worthless degree. And as my fingers closed around the thick paper, I realized this was the moment. This public space surrounded by witnesses was exactly where this needed to happen. And I pulled the envelope out slowly, deliberately, watching my parents' eyes track the movement and widen with recognition and growing panic. "Do you know what this is?" I asked, my voice level and clear enough that the families nearby stopped their own conversations to listen. And my mother's face went pale as she whispered, "Emma, please, let's not do this here." And I continued as if she hadn't spoken. "These are disownment papers, legal documents formally severing your parental relationship with me, which you gave me this morning at breakfast, along with some very specific commentary about my choices." And I watched my father's jaw clench as he realized what was happening, realized that I was about to expose exactly who they were in front of relatives and strangers and the Stanford community. And I turned to my mother and said, "You told me, and I quote, that my computer science degree was a waste of money and 4 years you could have spent finding a husband. You said I'd never amount to anything practical. And you informed me that my trust fund, the one my grandmother left specifically for me, was being given to Marcus instead because he had real ambition and business sense." And my mother opened her mouth to protest, but I didn't let her interrupt, turning to my father and continuing, "And you said that I was too impractical and head in the clouds to succeed in the real world, that you were cutting me off completely because it was time I learned that my little computer hobby wasn't going to pay bills. And you told me I was no longer your financial responsibility or your problem." And my father tried to cut in, saying, "Now, Emma, you're taking things out of context. We were just trying to encourage independence." But I didn't allow it, didn't let him rewrite what had happened just hours ago, and I turned to Marcus, who was staring at the ground, and said, "And you laughed. You made jokes about how I'd be working at some tech support call center while you built your business empire with my inheritance money. You said I'd wasted mom and dad's investment in my education." And the families around us were fully watching now, no longer pretending to give us privacy. And I saw Uncle Tom and Aunt Carol standing 10 feet away, with expressions of shock, and my mother's eyes were filling with tears, the manipulative kind she'd always been able to produce on command. And she said, "Emma, sweetheart, you're hurting. I understand, but you're misunderstanding what we meant. We were just trying to motivate you. We always believed in you." And the gaslighting was so blatant, so transparent, that I felt something crystallize inside me, something hard and final, And I said quietly but clearly, "Stop lying. You didn't believe in me this morning, and you don't believe in me now. You believe in $28.2 million." And Aunt Linda squeezed my hand supportively while my father's face flushed red with anger or embarrassment or both. I held up the disownment papers, lifting them high enough that the relatives and graduates surrounding us could see them clearly, and I said with perfect clarity, "So I'm going to accept these." Watching my mother's face drain of what little color remained, while my father's eyes widened with something that looked like genuine fear. And I continued, "You've made your position clear this morning. You disowned me legally and emotionally because you believed I had nothing to offer, because you thought my degree was worthless and my future was meaningless. And now that you've discovered I'm worth $28 million, you want to pretend this morning never happened? You want to rewrite history and claim you always believed in me, always supported me." And my father tried to interrupt, saying, "Emma, that's not what we meant. You're twisting our words. We were just trying to encourage you to be independent." But I cut him off sharply, my voice rising just enough to carry to the growing circle of witnesses. "Don't lie to me, and don't lie to everyone here. You told me specifically that my computer science degree was money down the drain. You said I was impractical and unmarriageable. You informed me I was being cut off completely, and that my inheritance was being given to Marcus because he had real potential." Those were your exact words, Richard. Your exact words, Patricia. And I watched my mother flinch at my use of her first name, the dropping of the parental title she'd never really earned. And she said desperately, "Emma, please, you're making a scene. People are watching. Can't we discuss this privately like adults?" And I felt something cold and final settle in my chest as I responded, "You're concerned about making a scene now? You weren't concerned about that this morning when you presented me with legal disownment papers over breakfast in a public restaurant. You weren't worried about who might overhear when you told me I was a disappointment and a waste of your investment." And Marcus finally spoke up, his voice uncertain and stripped of its usual arrogance, saying, "Come on, Emma, they're our parents. Family is family. We should work this out." But I turned to him with eyes that held no sibling affection and said, "Family is supposed to support each other, Marcus. Family is supposed to celebrate each other's successes, not just when there's money involved, but because they genuinely care, and you've never been my family in any way that matters." And I watched him step back, as if I'd physically struck him, and I returned my attention to my parents and announced clearly, "I'm accepting your disownment. I will not be attending family events. I will not be in contact with any of you. I've built my own life, and I don't need people who only value me when there's something in it for them." And my mother's careful social mask completely cracked as panic flooded her features, and she reached for me, saying, "No, Emma, no, you can't mean that. We're your parents, we love you, we've always loved you, please don't do this." But her words rang hollow after 22 years of making me feel invisible, and my father attempted one more time to employ the authoritative tone that had controlled me my entire childhood, saying, "Emma, that's enough. You're being dramatic and unreasonable. We're going to discuss this calmly, and you're going to stop this ridiculous display." But his voice held no power anymore because I'd finally realized that their authority over me had only ever existed because I'd granted it to them, and I stood there holding the disownment papers in the bright California sunshine, surrounded by witnesses to their desperation and my liberation. And I knew with absolute certainty that I was done being their overlooked daughter. My mother's panic became something physical and desperate as she grabbed my father's arm and said in a voice that carried far more than she intended, "Richard, we need Emma now. The business ventures didn't work out. Marcus lost the money. We don't have the trust fund anymore." And I watched my father's face go rigid with fury as he tried to silence her with a sharp, "Patricia, not here." But the damage was done. The truth was out in front of Uncle Tom and Aunt Carol and a dozen other relatives and strangers. And my mother continued as if she couldn't stop herself. "We were counting on that money. We thought Marcus would invest it properly. We thought Emma would just work some little tech job and we'd have the capital for Marcus's real opportunities." and I felt a cold vindication settle over me as their purely financial motives were laid bare for everyone to witness. And my father gripped my mother's elbow hard enough that she winced and fell silent. But I could see the calculation in his eyes, the desperate attempt to salvage the situation, and Marcus was staring at the ground with his hands shoved in his pockets, and I said very quietly, "So you gave away my inheritance, the money my grandmother left specifically for me, and now it's gone." And the silence that followed was broken by Marcus's voice, small and ashamed in a way I'd never heard from him. "I lost it, okay? I invested in a friend's startup and it went under in 4 months. I thought it was a sure thing. I thought I'd double the money and prove I could be successful too." And the admission hung in the air while I processed that my $250,000 inheritance had been gambled away on Marcus's need to prove himself. Money that could have paid off my student loans completely, loans I'd worked myself to exhaustion to pay down while they funded my brother's lifestyle, and my mother said desperately, "Emma, you have so much now, you could help us. You could help your brother. Family helps family. That's what we do." And I almost laughed at the audacity of it, at the transparent attempt to redefine family obligations now that I had something they wanted. And I said clearly enough for everyone to hear, "I worked 3 jobs during college to pay my tuition after you told me sophomore year that you were investing more in Marcus's education. I paid off $40,000 in student loans by myself while you funded Marcus's apartment and car and spring break trips. I built a company while taking a full course load and maintaining a perfect GPA, and I did all of it without a single dollar from you or a single word of encouragement." And I watched my mother's face crumple, and my father's jaw clench, and Marcus finally look up at me with something that might have been shame. And Aunt Linda's voice cut through the tension, saying firmly, "Emma doesn't owe any of you anything. You made your choices this morning, and she's making hers now, and I support her completely." And I saw Uncle Tom nod slowly, and Aunt Carol whisper something to another relative, and I knew that the truth of who my parents were, what they'd done, was spreading through our extended family in real time. And my father made one last attempt at control, saying, "Emma, don't make decisions in anger that you'll regret. We're still your parents, you still need us." But his words held no weight anymore because I'd just proven in front of hundreds of people that I'd never needed them, that I'd succeeded spectacularly despite them rather than because of them. And I stood there holding those disownment papers and looking at the 3 people who should have loved me unconditionally, but had only ever valued me conditionally. And I knew with perfect certainty that I was done. My father drew himself up with that familiar authoritative posture that had intimidated me for 22 years and said in a voice that attempted command but came out edged with desperation, "Emma, you're going to regret this. We'll tell everyone our side of the story. We'll make sure the whole family knows how ungrateful and vindictive you've been, how we sacrificed for your education, and you've turned on us the moment you had success." And I felt something like pity mix with my anger, because he still thought he had leverage, still thought he could control the narrative, and I pulled out my phone with steady hands and said clearly, "You mean you'll tell them your version of events? But I have the actual evidence. I have every dismissive text message you've sent me over the past 4 years, every email where you told me I was wasting my potential, every voicemail where you compared me unfavorably to Marcus. I have the messages from this morning confirming the disownment. I have documentation of the trust fund transfer to Marcus, and I have approximately 50 witnesses who just watched you try to reclaim me the moment you discovered I'm worth $28 million. And I watched the blood drain from my father's face as he realized I'd been more prepared than he'd ever given me credit for, and my mother said desperately, "Emma, please, we can work this out. Families have disagreements. We can go to therapy together. We can fix this. Just don't cut us out completely, I'm begging you." But her words felt manipulative rather than genuine because she'd had 22 years to suggest family therapy, 22 years to address the blatant favoritism and emotional neglect, and she'd only become interested in fixing our relationship when there was money involved. And I said with a finality that came from somewhere deep and certain within me, "I'm setting boundaries that should have existed years ago." There will be no contact between us. You will not call me, text me, email me, or show up. At my home or workplace, you are not welcome in my life, and if you violate these boundaries, I will pursue legal action for harassment. And my mother actually collapsed into sobs that might have been partially genuine beneath the manipulation, crying about losing her daughter and not knowing how things got so bad. And I felt Aunt Linda's supportive presence beside me as I said something I'd needed to say for years. Patricia, you lost me a long time ago. You lost me every time you ignored my achievements to praise Marcus's mediocrity. You lost me every time you dismissed my interests as unmarriageable quirks. You lost me every time you made me feel invisible in my own family. You're just noticing now because there's something you want from me. And Marcus finally spoke up with what sounded like an attempt at sincerity, saying, Emma, I'm sorry. I really am. I know I've been a terrible brother. I know I took advantage of the favoritism. I should have stood up for you and I didn't. And I'm genuinely sorry for that. But his apology rang hollow because it came only after his investments failed and his privilege evaporated. And I looked at him and said quietly, Marcus, you're apologizing because you need something, not because you've genuinely reflected on 22 years of cruelty, and I don't have space in my life for self-interested apologies. And my father's bluster had completely deflated, his shoulders slumped, his commanding presence reduced to a man facing consequences he'd never anticipated, and Aunt Linda asked softly, Emma, honey, can I stay in your life? I know I'm part of this family, but I've tried to support you. I've tried to see you. And I turned to her with the first genuine warmth I'd felt in this entire nightmare conversation and said, Linda, you're the only one who ever showed up for me. The only one who noticed when I won awards or achieved something meaningful. You're absolutely welcome in my life because you've actually been family to me in the ways that matter. And I watched my mother's face contort with something like jealousy even through her tears, and I knew that this was the moment of final separation, the clean break I needed to build the life I deserved, and I held those disownment papers in my hand like both a weapon and a shield, proof of their rejection and permission for my liberation. I turned away from my parents with Aunt Linda's hand warm in mine, and I walked through the crowd of graduates and families without looking back, though I felt their stares on my back like physical weight. And when I finally did glance over my shoulder, I saw Richard and Patricia and Marcus standing in a tight, defeated cluster. My father's commanding posture completely collapsed, my mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while looking around at the relatives who'd witnessed everything. My brother with his hands shoved deep in his pockets staring at the ground, and I felt a complicated surge of emotions that I knew would take years to fully process, triumph and grief and liberation all tangled together in my chest. Because I'd wanted vindication, but I'd also wanted love. I'd wanted them to be proud of me, but I'd also wanted them to be good people who didn't require my net worth to value me. And the reality that they weren't those people hurt even as I accepted it as truth. Aunt Linda squeezed my hand and said softly, You did the right thing, sweetheart. You set boundaries you should have set years ago, and I'm so proud of you. And her words felt like balm on a wound that was finally being cleaned properly, even though the process was painful. And I spotted Jessica and my roommates Sarah and Devin waiting near the edge of the crowd. And when Jessica saw me, she broke into a run and wrapped me in a hug that felt like coming home, and she said, We saw everything. We heard most of it. Emma, you were amazing. You stood up for yourself. You didn't back down. And Sarah added, Your parents are unbelievable. The audacity of them trying to reclaim you after that morning. And Devin just hugged me tightly and said, We're your family now. The family you chose and who chose you. And I felt tears finally come. Not tears of sadness, but tears of release, of letting go of the fantasy of parental love I'd been chasing for 22 years. We went to Zola, a French bistro near campus that we'd dreamed about eating at, but could never afford as students. And I told them today we were celebrating properly, my treat, and we sat at a table near the window, with the afternoon sun streaming in, and ordered champagne and appetizers and entrees without looking at the prices, and Jessica toasted, To Emma, who built an empire while we were all just trying to pass our finals. And Sarah toasted to chosen family and women supporting women. And Devin toasted to proving every single person wrong who ever underestimated you. And I felt surrounded by genuine love and support in a way I'd never experienced with my biological family. And then the server came to our table and said there was someone who'd like to join us if we were accepting guests. And I looked up to see James Chen standing there in his suit with a warm smile, and he said, "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to properly toast your success without 500 people watching. And also to tell you that your parents' behavior today was appalling, and you handled it with more grace than they deserved." And we made room for him at our table, and he shared stories about his own complicated family dynamics, about building success and having relatives suddenly emerge wanting support, about the importance of surrounding yourself with people who valued you before you had anything to offer. And I realized, sitting there with Jessica and Sarah and Devin and Aunt Linda and James Chen, that I'd been building my real family all along without quite realizing it. That family wasn't about biology or obligation, but about mutual respect and genuine care. And my worth had never been dependent on my parents' recognition because I'd proven it to myself and found people who saw it clearly. And for the first time in my entire life, I felt completely at peace with exactly who I was. 6 months later, I stood in my apartment in San Francisco's Soma district, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city where I'd built my new life. And I held another package from my parents in my hands without opening it, the fifth one they'd sent since graduation, each one sitting unopened in my closet alongside the letters and cards that arrived with increasing desperation every few weeks. And I felt nothing but a calm certainty that I'd made the right choice because the peace I'd found was worth more than any reconciliation built on their need, rather than genuine transformation. My life at TechVision had exceeded every expectation. My role as Director of Educational Innovation, allowing me to shape technology that would help millions of students learn more effectively, and I'd spoken at 3 major tech conferences in the past 4 months. My face appearing in Forbes and Wired and TechCrunch articles about young innovators reshaping education, and each achievement felt purely mine in a way nothing had when I'd been seeking my parents' approval, because I was building something meaningful without the weight of their judgment or the pain of their dismissal. Aunt Linda visited every other weekend, and we'd grown closer than we'd ever been. Her spare room in Berkeley becoming a refuge where I could process the complicated grief of choosing myself over family obligation. And she never pressured me to reconcile or suggested that blood should trump boundaries. She simply loved me consistently and showed up reliably and proved that family could be something healthy and supportive. I'd started therapy in July, finding a woman named Dr. Patel who specialized in family trauma and childhood emotional neglect. And through our weekly sessions, I was learning to name the patterns that had shaped me, to recognize that the invisibility I'd felt wasn't a reflection of my worth, but a failure of my parents' capacity to see beyond their own narrow definitions of success and value. And I was slowly untangling my sense of self from their judgment, building an identity that belonged entirely to me. Last week, I'd attended the Tech Innovators Gala, where I was honored on the 30 Under 30 list, alongside other young founders and creators, and I'd sat at a table with 5 other women who'd built remarkable companies, and during dinner, we'd somehow gotten onto the topic of family, and I'd learned that 3 of them had similar stories of parental rejection or dismissal, followed by desperate reconciliation attempts after success, and we'd laughed and cried and shared war stories, and I'd felt less alone than I ever had, understood by people who'd walked similar paths and chosen themselves despite the cost. Standing at the podium last Tuesday at the Women in STEM conference, I'd looked out at 200 young women and girls who reminded me of my younger self, hungry to prove themselves and seeking validation from people who might never give it. And I'd told them something I wished someone had told me at 15, that their worth wasn't determined by family validation or anyone else's recognition, that they could build extraordinary lives and find people who saw them clearly and loved them genuinely. and I'd watched several of them wipe away tears, and I'd known that sharing my story mattered, that the pain I'd experienced could become purpose if I let it. I thought about the girl who'd walked across that graduation stage 6 months ago, holding disownment papers with shaking hands, feeling both broken and defiant, not yet knowing if she could survive without her family's approval. And I looked at the woman I'd become, standing in an apartment she'd bought herself with money she'd earned through her own brilliance and hard work, surrounded by chosen family and meaningful work and genuine peace. And I understood that I hadn't just survived the rejection, I'd been freed by it to become fully myself, without apology or compromise. And that girl with the disownment papers had walked toward this life without knowing where it would lead, trusting only that she deserved more than crumbs of conditional love, and she'd been right.